The light in the cell is grey before it is gold. It comes in low, through a narrow window cut near the ceiling, and it moves across the stone floor so slowly that a man who has nothing else to do could watch it travel an inch in an hour. Outside, Athens is waking up. Carts on the road to the harbour. A dog somewhere. The clatter of a bucket being filled at a well. Ordinary sounds. The kind that belong to a city that has no idea, this particular morning, that anything unusual is happening at all. Inside the cell, on a low stone bench, an old man is sitting with his legs still hooked over the edge because a servant has just come in and struck off his chains, and the feeling of blood moving freely again through his ankles seems, for a moment, to interest him more than anything else in the world. He rubs the skin where the iron sat. He laughs, quietly, to himself. He says, to no one in particular, that it's strange how closely pleasure and pain are tied together. How the two things that seem like opposites, that seem like they could never occupy the same body at the same time, chase each other in a circle, so that relief from one always feels like the beginning of the other. If a man could catch the two of them and hold them still long enough, he says, he thinks a poet could make something of it. A fable, maybe, the god who wanted to weld pleasure and pain into a single head and, failing that, join them at least by the tail, so that where one goes, the other follows soon after. It is a small, almost throwaway observation. The kind of thing you say when you're waiting for someone. And in a way, he's waiting. Not for a doctor, not for a meal, not for news from the city. He's waiting to die. Today. Before the sun goes down, if the ferry from the island of Delos comes in on schedule, which everyone in the room has been watching for, with a kind of held breath they are trying not to show. This is the last morning of the life of Socrates, the philosopher, in the city of Athens, in the spring of the year 399, before the modern calendar begins counting. He is around 70 years old. He has spent the last month in this cell, sentenced to death by a jury of his fellow citizens, for the crime, as the formal charge put it, of corrupting the young and failing to honor the city's gods. Neither of these things, as far as we can tell from what has survived of the record, was really what killed him. What killed him was something harder to write down on a charge sheet. Decades of asking uncomfortable questions to powerful people in a city that had just been through a war, a coup, and a restoration of democracy, and had very little patience left for a 70-year-old man standing in the marketplace asking generals and poets and priests to explain, in plain terms, what they meant by justice, or courage, or piety, and then showing, gently but completely, that they couldn't. To understand why he is sitting so calmly on a stone bench on the last morning of his life, you have to go back a little. Not far, just far enough to see the shape of the man. He was born in Athens, the son of a stonemason, or possibly a sculptor. The ancient sources aren't fully certain which, and it may not have mattered much even then, since the two trades overlapped. His mother, by most accounts, worked as a midwife, He would later say, and this is one of the few details from his life that feels almost too neat to be true, except that it comes up again and again in what his students wrote, that he thought of his own work as a kind of midwifery too. Not delivering babies, but delivering ideas. He believed, or at least he liked to say, that he had no wisdom of his own to hand out. What he could do was ask questions that helped other people discover they either knew something they hadn't realized they knew, or far more often, that they didn't actually know the thing they'd been so sure of a few minutes earlier. This turned out to be a deeply unwelcome gift. Athens in his lifetime was proud of itself, and had reason to be. It had beaten back a Persian invasion within living memory. It had built the temples on the hill above the city, marble so white it looked, people said, like something that had fallen from the sky rather than being carried up a hillside by human hands. It ran for a while, something close to what we would recognize as a direct democracy. Citizens voting on laws, serving on juries, taking turns holding office by lottery rather than by birth or wealth. It was also, like every ancient city, built partly on the backs of people who had no vote at all, and it fought a long, exhausting, ultimately losing war against Sparta that reshaped and in some ways broke its confidence in itself. Socrates lived through almost all of it. He served as a soldier, heavy infantry, the kind of fighting that was close and brutal, and left men standing shoulder to shoulder in a line, unable to run without exposing the man next to them. Those who fought beside him described him, years later, as strange, even on the battlefield, able to stand still for a full day and night, lost in thought, apparently indifferent to the cold or the danger, until whatever question had seized him let him go. But it was not the battlefield that made him famous or infamous. It was the marketplace, the gymnasium, the porches where young men gathered to talk. He would find someone a general, a poet, a priest, a promising young aristocrat with more confidence than reflection. And he would ask, in the most ordinary tone imaginable, something like, "What is courage?" Not as a trap, not as a performance, but as a real question, asked with what seems to have been genuine curiosity. And then he would listen to the answer and ask a follow-up, and another, until the person's confident definition had quietly come apart in their own hands, undone not by an insult, but by their own words, laid out one after another, until the contradiction was impossible to miss. He called this his method, though it wasn't really a method so much as a habit of mind. Later thinkers would give it a name, the elenchus, from a Greek word that just means a kind of testing or cross-examination. But you don't need the Greek word to understand it. It is simply this: ask someone to say clearly what they mean, and keep asking, gently, until either the idea holds up or it doesn't. Most of the time, in his experience, it didn't. And most people, understandably, did not enjoy discovering that in public. He was, by his own account and by everyone else's, unconcerned with money, with reputation, with comfort. He walked barefoot through Athens in every season, He wore the same rough cloak, whether it was summer or winter. He had a wife, Xanthippe, and 3 sons, one of them still a young boy at the time of his death, and he seems to have loved his family in his own distracted, difficult way, without ever letting that love reorganize his priorities around wealth or safety, the way it reorganizes most people's lives. He turned down opportunities to charge fees for his conversations. Unlike the traveling teachers of the time, the sophists, as they were called, who taught the sons of the wealthy how to win arguments in the assembly and in court for a price, Socrates thought that was close to a kind of fraud, teaching people to sound wise rather than to be wise, teaching them to win rather than to find the truth. He wanted no part of it, and he had no patience for those who did. He also believed, and said so, that he had a kind of inner voice. He called it his daimonion, a private divine sign that never told him what to do, but sometimes, at certain moments, told him what not to do. It had stopped him, he said, from entering politics, which in Athens was a fast and often fatal business. It is one of the small ironies of his life that the same instinct that kept him out of the political arena did nothing to protect him from the trial that would end it. A trial that was, in its own way, entirely political, even though it was dressed up as a religious charge. By the time he stood before the jury, in the spring before this last spring, Athens had recently lived through a nightmare. The city had lost the long war with Sparta. A group of ruthless men, remembered ever since as the 30 tyrants had briefly seized power with Spartan backing and had murdered or exiled a large number of their fellow citizens before democracy was restored at real cost by citizens who fought to take the city back. Several of the men associated, fairly or not, with Socrates' circle of young followers had been mixed up in that period of tyranny, most notoriously a brilliant, reckless aristocrat named Alcibiades, who had studied with Socrates as a young man and gone on to a career of dazzling, disastrous political ambition, and one of the 30 tyrants themselves. A man named Crito, who had also once sat and listened to Socrates ask his questions in the gymnasium. None of that appeared in the official charge against him. Officially, he was accused of not believing in the city's gods and of corrupting the youth of Athens. But underneath the official charge, everyone in the courtroom understood the real one, that this strange old man, who spent his days asking Athens' most confident citizens to justify themselves, and who had taught, or at least talked with, some of the very men who had helped bring the city to its knees, was, in some hard-to-define but deeply felt way, dangerous. A city that has just survived a trauma does not always reach for careful distinctions. It reaches for someone to blame. At his trial, he did not grovel. He did not weep, or bring his weeping children into the courtroom to soften the jury, which was a common and expected tactic of the time. He gave a defense the apology, as it came to be called, though the Greek word behind that title just means a defense speech, not an apology in our modern sense of regret, in which he explained, calmly and at times with visible amusement, exactly why he had spent his life doing what he did. He told the jury a story that a friend of his had once gone to the oracle at Delphi and asked whether anyone in Athens was wiser than Socrates, and the oracle had said no. Socrates said this had baffled him because he was certain he knew nothing of any importance. So he had gone around the city, testing the claim, talking to politicians, poets, and craftsmen, each of whom seemed wise, each of whom, under a little questioning, turned out to be confident about things they did not actually understand. He concluded that the oracle might have been right after all, in a strange, backhanded way, that he alone among these men knew that he did not know. That small, honest acknowledgement of his own ignorance was, in his telling, the whole of his wisdom. He told the jury, near the end, a sentence that has outlived almost everything else about him, and that his students would repeat for the rest of their lives, that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. He didn't mean it as a slogan. He meant it, it seems, quite literally, that a life spent never asking what you actually believe, never testing your own assumptions about right and wrong, about what's worth wanting, was to him barely a human life at all, just a body going through motions. The jury convicted him narrowly, by most estimates, a vote that could easily have gone the other way. And then, under Athenian law, there was a second vote, on the penalty. The prosecutors proposed death. Socrates was given the chance to propose an alternative punishment for himself. And this is the moment where, if he had wanted to save his own life, he might have done it, proposed exile, say, which the jury might well have accepted instead. He did not do that. He suggested, half seriously, that what he actually deserved was free meals for life at the city's expense, as a public benefactor, the kind of honor given to Olympic victors. It did not go over well. When pressed to name a serious alternative, he offered a modest fine, which his friends, including a young man named Plato, offered to guarantee. The jury, angered by what many took as arrogance, voted for death by a wider margin than they had voted for conviction in the first place. There is a detail here that matters, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy to rush past it. Executions in Athens were normally carried out quickly after sentencing, but a sacred ship was sent every year to the island of Delos to commemorate an old story, the ship that the hero Theseus once sailed to Crete and back, saving Athens from a yearly tribute of young lives to the Minotaur. While that ship was away on its voyage, the city could not carry out any executions, because the city had to remain richly pure until it returned. The ship happened to leave for Delos the day before Socrates' trial ended, which meant that instead of dying within a day or two, as was normal, he was given a month. A whole month in prison, waiting. Most people, told they had a month left to live, might spend it in panic or denial or frantic unfinished business. Socrates, by every account that survives, spent it talking with his friends the same way he had spent every other month of his adult life. Friends came and went from the cell. The guards, oddly, seemed to have allowed a great deal of freedom for visitors, and there's a detail in the record suggesting Socrates was not always in chains during this period, that they were only put on him at certain points, perhaps at night. He talked about the soul, about justice, about what a good life required. He was not performing calm for an audience. He seems, as far as we can reconstruct it, to have simply been who he had always been, in a room that happened to be a prison instead of a marketplace. Early in that month, one of his oldest and wealthiest friends, a man named Crito, came to visit him with a plan. He had arranged everything: bribes for the guards, already partly paid, a safe route out of the city, friends abroad in Thessaly who would take Socrates in. Escape, in fact, was not even especially difficult to arrange in Athenian prisons of the period. Guards were poorly paid and often looked the other way for the right price, and it seems to have been more common than the modern imagination assumes. Crito wasn't proposing anything wildly implausible. He came to the cell in the very early morning, before dawn, having bribed his way in ahead of the usual visiting hour, and he sat by Socrates' bed and watched him sleep for a while before waking him, because he admitted he envied how peacefully the old man slept on the last few nights of his life, while Crito himself had not slept at all. When Socrates woke, Crito laid it out. He was worried, he said, not only about losing a friend, but about how it would look that people would think Crito and the others hadn't spent the money, hadn't tried hard enough, had let their friend die out of stinginess or cowardice. He begged Socrates to think of his sons, who would grow up without a father. He said there was still time. The ship might arrive that very day. Every hour mattered. Socrates' response to all of this is one of the clearest windows we have into how his mind actually worked. And it's worth walking through slowly, because it isn't a slogan. It's an argument, built step by step, the same way he built every argument, out in the marketplace, with strangers. He begins by saying gently that Crito's fear of what other people will think shouldn't be the thing that decides this. Not all opinions are equal, he says. The opinion of a doctor about your body matters more than the opinion of the crowd, because the doctor actually knows something about bodies, and the crowd mostly doesn't. In the same way, he says, when it comes to questions of right and wrong, what matters is not what most people will say, but what is actually true. And the only way to get closer to the truth of a question like this is to reason it through carefully, the way they always have, rather than letting fear or public opinion make the decision for them. So he asks Crito to reason it through with him. Is it ever right, he asks, to do wrong to someone, even if that person has wronged you first? Most people would say yes, an eye for an eye seems fair, seems almost obviously fair. But Socrates and Crito, going back over ground they've covered many times before in their long friendship, agree that it isn't actually fair, that doing wrong in return for wrong just adds one more wrong to the world, and that a person who cares about living rightly cannot allow himself that exception, no matter how much the other side may deserve it. Then Socrates turns the question toward his own situation. If he escapes, he says, he will be breaking the laws of Athens, the very laws that raised him, educated him, protected his marriage, allowed his father to raise him as a citizen. He imagines, almost like a small piece of theatre, the laws of the city themselves standing before him and asking, "What complaint do you have against us, that you would destroy us, as far as you are able, by fleeing your sentence? Have we not treated you well your whole life? Did you not have 70 years in which you could have left the city if you found our laws so intolerable and gone to live somewhere else, under different laws? You never left. You married here, raised children here, benefited from everything we provided. And now, because we have made a decision you don't like, you would simply break the agreement and run. This is, in effect, one of the earliest surviving arguments for something we would now call the social contract. The idea that by choosing to live in a place, to use its laws, to raise a family under its protection, you take on an implicit obligation to accept its legitimate decisions, even the ones that go against you, rather than tearing up the whole arrangement whenever it becomes personally inconvenient. Socrates is not saying the verdict against him was just. He believed and said plainly at his trial that it wasn't. What he's saying is something narrower and, in its way, more demanding, that the right response to an unjust verdict reached through a legitimate process is not to secretly undermine the process itself, especially not for a man who has spent his whole life publicly arguing that doing wrong is worse than suffering wrong. He tells Crito that if he ran now, in his 70s, to some other city, he would arrive as an old fugitive with no real welcome anywhere, spending what remained of his life explaining himself. A walking argument against everything he'd tried to teach. And his sons, the very sons Crito had invoked to persuade him, would be better cared for by his friends after his death than they would be if he dragged them into exile with a father who had broken faith with his own principles to save his skin. Crito has no answer to this. Socrates asks him, at the end, whether there's anything more to say, and Crito tells him, quietly, that there isn't. It's worth pausing here, in the small hours of the story, on the strangeness of what just happened. A man has just turned down his own rescue, using an argument, out loud, to a friend who loved him enough to arrange it. There's no shouting in this scene, no despair, no grand gesture. It reads more like two old friends finishing a conversation they've had many times before, in many different forms, across many years, a conversation about what a person owes to the community that raised them and what they owe to their own sense of what's right when those two things pull in different directions. Socrates decided, once again, the way he'd apparently decided every time this question came up in his life, that the second one wins. Not because the city was right, because breaking faith with it in secret, to save himself, would have been a smaller way to live than the one he'd already chosen. Time moves forward now, toward the final day. The ship from Delos, word finally comes, has been sighted off the coast on its way back. It will dock that day, or the next. The sentence can be carried out. On what turns out to be the last morning, his friends gather in the cell earlier than usual, earlier, even than the guards would normally allow, because word has spread that this is likely to be the day, and the porter, moved by something, lets them all inside before the usual hour and tells them to wait. When Socrates' wife, Xanthippe, is brought in and sees the group of visitors arriving. She cries out, the way people do at deathbeds in every century, that this is the last time her husband will be able to speak with his friends. Socrates, we're told, asks that she be taken home, and she is led away, weeping, by one of the men in the group. What follows, across that final day, is a long conversation, the fullest and strangest conversation of Socrates' life, held with a small circle of friends and students, in a room that everyone in it knows is about to become the room where he dies. Two of the men present, Simmias and Cebes, had travelled from Thebes to be there. A young student named Phaedo was in the room too. And it's from him, or rather, from an account written down afterward by another student, Plato, who was not himself present that day, being sick, he tells us, and unable to attend, that the conversation has come down to us. Whatever a modern reader makes of the philosophical details, the human scene at the center of it is almost unbearably vivid. Friends gathered around a man they love on the day he is going to die. Talking, because talking is what they have always done together. And because Socrates, apparently, wants to keep doing it until there's nothing left to say. The conversation that day turns, again and again, to a single question. Should a person who is about to die be afraid? And underneath that, what actually happens to a person when they die? Socrates' answer worked out across hours of back and forth with Simmias and Cebes, who pushed back on him hard, the way good students do, refusing to simply accept what he says just because he's the one saying it is, in its bones, fairly simple, even if the arguments supporting it are intricate. He says that philosophy, properly understood, is itself a kind of practice for dying, not in a morbid sense. What he means is that philosophy, as he practiced it, was always an attempt to pull the mind's attention away from the body, away from appetite, from physical pleasure, from the noise of wanting things, and toward clearer, calmer, more honest thought. Death, he says, is simply the final and complete version of that same separation. The soul, whatever it is, finally free of the body's constant demands and distractions. A person who has spent his life training himself to care less about bodily pleasures and more about truth and goodness, he argues, should not fear the moment when the body falls away entirely. If anything, that person has been practicing for this exact moment his whole life. He offers his friends several arguments for why the soul might survive the body arguments, involving how opposites seem to come from opposites in nature. Arguments about how certain kinds of knowledge, the example he liked to use was mathematical knowledge, like recognizing what makes two things equal, seem to come from somewhere the senses alone can't fully explain, as though the soul had encountered these truths before birth and simply remembers them. Modern philosophers have picked these arguments apart in every possible direction over the following 2,000 years, and Socrates' own students in the room that day weren't fully convinced. Either Simmias in particular presses him with a sharp counter-argument, comparing the soul to the harmony of a tuned instrument, something that seems to depend entirely on the physical strings and would surely die when they break. It's a real philosophical conversation, not a comforting speech full of genuine disagreement, genuine uncertainty, right up until the end, but underneath the specific arguments, which the listener doesn't need to follow point by point to feel the weight of the scene. There's something simpler happening. A man is trying to explain to people he loves why he is not afraid. And the explanation he keeps circling back to isn't really about proofs at all. It's about how he's lived. He says, at one point, that if death is nothing a total, dreamless absence, like a night's sleep so deep that no dream ever intrudes on it, then it is nothing to fear at all. No different from the peaceful gap between falling asleep and waking, except that it never ends. And so there is no waking on the other side to feel the loss of it. And if, instead, death is a passage to some other place where the souls of the dead gather, then that too, he says, is nothing to fear, and perhaps even something to welcome, because he would finally get to meet and question and talk with all the great figures of the past he'd only ever heard about in stories. Either way, he tells them, a good man has nothing to fear in death, not in life, and not after it, because nothing genuinely bad can happen to a good man, whether he's alive or dead. He is not saying this to be brave in front of an audience. Read closely. It sounds like a man thinking out loud about something he has clearly been thinking about in one form or another, for years, turning the question over one more time. This time with the stakes as real and as close as they will ever be, and finding that his answer, however imperfect the logic, still holds. As the day wears on, the conversation slows. Someone brings food, and Socrates eats and drinks with them, unhurried. The sun climbs and starts its long fall toward evening. At one point, Crito asks whether he has any final instructions about his burial, about anything at all he wants done. Socrates answers with what seems to have been real, gentle amusement, that Crito can bury him however he likes, if he can catch him meaning, if he can catch the real Socrates, and not just the body that will be left behind. He's making a small joke, one last time, about the very question they've spent the whole day discussing, that the man his friends love is not, in the end, this particular collection of flesh and bone sitting on this bench, and that whatever is about to happen to that collection of flesh and bone is not really the thing to be afraid of. Toward the end of the afternoon, the jailer comes in a man who, we're told, had come to respect Socrates over the weeks of his imprisonment, unlike most prisoners who cursed the guards who brought them their sentence. He tells him, with something close to sorrow in his voice, that it is time, and that most men, upon hearing this, rage at him as though he, the lowest official in the whole business, was somehow responsible for the law and the verdict, rather than merely the one sent to carry out the final step. He says he knows Socrates isn't like the others, that he has watched him these past weeks and found him the gentlest, most even-tempered man ever to pass through this cell. Then he begins to weep, turns away, and leaves the room, unable to finish the formal request he'd come to deliver. Socrates watches him go and says to the group that the man was a good sort, that he'd come to visit and talk with him even outside the required duties over the past weeks, and had always treated him decently. Then he asks Crito to send for the poison if it's ready. Crito tries one more time to slow things down. He says the sun is still on the mountains, that other men in this situation eat and drink well into the evening before finally taking the drug, that there's no need to rush, that there is still time. Socrates' answer is, in its way, the quietest and most devastating line of the entire day. He says that the men Crito is describing are right to act that way from their own point of view, since they think they gain something by delaying a few more hours of pleasure, a last meal savored longer than usual. But he, Socrates, sees nothing to be gained by drinking a little later rather than a little sooner, except making himself ridiculous in his own eyes, clinging to a life that is already, by every measure that matters to him, over. He asks Crito to do as he says, and not otherwise. The poison is hemlock, ground and mixed into a drink, prepared by the man responsible for that part of the process. It's brought in by an attendant, and Socrates asks him, quite naturally, what he ought to do, whether he should simply drink it, or whether there's some ritual involved. The attendant tells him only to drink it, and then walk about until his legs begin to feel heavy, and then to lie down, and the drug will do the rest. Socrates asks whether it would be permitted to pour a small portion out as an offering to the gods, the way one would with wine at a meal. An old habit of gratitude he doesn't want to abandon even now. The attendant tells him there isn't quite enough prepared for that. Socrates accepts this without complaint. He says a prayer instead, asking simply that his journey from this world to the next go well. And then, we are told, with a perfectly calm and steady hand, and without any change in his color or his expression, he drinks the cup down. Until this point, most of the men in the room had somehow managed to hold themselves together, but at the sight of him actually drinking it, several of them break down. Apollodorus, who had been weeping on and off through much of the day already, cries out loudly. Crito gets up and has to leave the room for a moment to compose himself. Even Phaedo, who is telling us all of this afterward, admits he could not stop his own tears and wrapped his face in his cloak to hide them. Socrates is the only one in the room who doesn't cry. He looks around at them, his friends, undone, weeping openly around him, and he asks them, with something between gentleness and mild reproof, what on earth they're doing. He says this is exactly why he sent the women away earlier, because they tend to make a scene like this, and a man ought to be allowed to die in peace. He tells them to be calm and to bear it bravely. At this, the room quiets. The men, ashamed of their own tears in the face of his composure, wipe their faces and grow still. Socrates begins to walk, as the attendant told him to, back and forth across the small room. After a while, he says his legs feel heavy, and he lies down on his back as instructed. The attendant checks his feet, then his legs, pressing hard and asking if he can feel it. Socrates says no. The numbness climbs feet, then calves, then higher, the attendant marking its progress by touch, telling the room, quietly, that when the cold reaches the heart, it will be over. As the chill reaches his waist, Socrates, who has been lying quietly with his face uncovered, pulls the cloak up over himself. Then, after a moment, he uncovers his face one more time because he has one more thing to say. He tells Crito that he owes a rooster to the god of healing, Asclepius, a small, ordinary debt, the kind of thing you'd say to a friend on any ordinary morning, and asks him to make sure it's paid and not forgotten. Crito asks if there's anything else. There's no answer. A little while later, the attendant uncovers his face. His eyes are fixed and still. Those last words, the debt of a rooster to Asclepius, have puzzled and moved readers for over 2,000 years, and no one has ever agreed on exactly what he meant by them. Asclepius was the god people thanked with a small sacrifice, typically when they recovered from an illness. Some who have written about this moment think Socrates meant it as one final, gentle joke, that death itself was the cure for the sickness of living in a body, and that a debt was owed to the god who had, in his own way, healed him at last. Others think it was simpler than that. An old man, in his final seconds of consciousness, remembering an unpaid household debt, and wanting, out of nothing more than long habit and decency, to make sure it didn't go unsettled. Maybe it was both. Maybe, for a man who had spent his whole life insisting that ordinary conversations, held with ordinary attention, were where the real work of living well actually happened. There was no contradiction between the two, at all a joke and a debt and a small act of care, folded into a single, final, perfectly ordinary sentence. What Plato and the others took from that room and carried out into the rest of their lives was not really a set of arguments about the soul. Plato himself would spend decades afterward building whole systems of philosophy that grew, in one way or another, out of trying to make sense of what he had lost that day, even though, by his own account, he wasn't even in the room. What seems to have mattered most in the end wasn't the logic of the arguments about immortality, which even the people in the room weren't fully persuaded by. What mattered was the shape of the man they'd watched. Someone who had spent his whole life insisting that living well and living examined were the same thing, and who, given a final chance to prove whether he actually believed that or had only ever been saying it, simply kept living the same way, all the way to the very last hour, without changing a single thing about how he spoke, or how he treated the people in the room, or what he thought was worth caring about. He didn't die a martyr making speeches. He died a man finishing a conversation, worrying briefly about a small debt, gently telling his friends to stop crying so he could go in peace. There is something almost unbearably human in that, more human, in a way, than a grander death would have been. No lightning, no vision, no final revelation. Just an old man walking slowly back and forth across a small stone room, waiting for his legs to go numb, still more concerned with the comfort of the people around him than with himself. It's a strange thing to sit with. This late at night, the idea that a person could face the end of everything they know, everything they are, with that kind of stillness. Not because he had solved death, or explained it away, or proven beyond doubt what came next. He hadn't. He said as much himself, more than once at that day. What he seemed to have found, instead, somewhere in all those years of questions asked in the marketplace, was a way of living that didn't depend on the answer. A life spent caring more about what was true and good than about what was safe or comfortable. Turns out, it seems, to leave a person surprisingly little to fear when the safety and comfort run out for good. Maybe that's the only thing worth carrying out of this story and into sleep tonight. Not an argument, not a lesson. Just the quiet, almost unremarkable image of a man lying back on a stone bench, pulling a cloak over himself, and going still, having spent one more ordinary day, right up until the very end, doing the only thing he ever really wanted to do. Talking honestly with people he loved about what actually matters. The room around him would have gone quiet after that. The light through the high window would have kept moving, the way it always had, indifferent, patient, sliding slowly across the stone floor toward evening. Sleep well.